But what is the self? What if your inner voice is actually somebody else? What if there is no self? Because the self is always changing. These are phrases I'm sure you've heard a lot since they legalized weed over much of the country. But what if they're more than just high thoughts? I read this really interesting article by this man named Chris Niebauer. It's called Eastern Philosophy Says There Is No Self, and Science Agrees. I agree about 65% with this article. If you see my videos about Goffman, about Skinner, about Witz, you might know that I tend to agree with this philosophy, but there is definitely some wiggle room in there. The article is linked at the bottom for those of you who want to read further. There's always more resources for you. There's always more. There's always deeper down the rabbit hole. I will summarize briefly and then we'll discuss questions. Now, Niebauer starts by summarizing the Western idea of self, that we believe that our inner voice or our ego is who that we are and that is fixed. However, he says, the thinking mind reinvents the self from moment to moment such that it in no way resembles the stable, coherent self most believe it to be. Put another way, it is the process of thinking that creates the self, rather than there being a self having any independent existence separate from thought. The self is more like a verb than a noun. Very good. I like that a lot. Verb, not a noun. What is his evidence for this claim? Well, first, there is no self part of the brain. The brain has been fully mapped and there's no area dedicated to self. Then he cites the research of Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga. Oh man, I probably butchered that. They divided the brain into two hemispheres, left and right. These are for stroke patients. So now remember that the brain is cross-wired with the body, so the left controls the right side and the right controls the left side. Now, Sperry and Gazzaniga studied split brain patients, meaning they could talk to one hemisphere without the other hemisphere knowing. Now, they instructed the right brain to walk, and the patient did. And then they asked the patient, hey, why did you walk? And they always made up some excuse like, oh, I went to get a Coke. But no, you didn't. That's just the story your brain is telling yourself as to why you walked. And they instructed the right brain to laugh, and the patient laughed. Then they asked the left brain, hey, why did you laugh about that? And they would crack these jokes, making excuses for why they laughed. But no, it's not true. That's just the story that they made up to make sense of their actions. Remember when Skinner said that you do not run because you're scared because you run? That was from a video about free will. That was a while back. I'll link that at the bottom too. We'll go back to scene. So what Niebauer says is that the story we tell ourselves about ourselves is just an interpretation of who we are and not who we really are. We could be completely wrong. Now, in general, I will say this is a failing of language. We can only describe a thing to the best of our ability and with the ideas that we're already familiar with. The better we are with language, the closer we actually get to describing reality. But our description is not reality itself. So imagine you see a colorful snake. Do you spend all your time describing the colors of the snake, or do you just run and get out of its way? So the one who survives just runs and gets out of its way and is not maybe as intelligent as the one who describes the snake. Are you going to narrate your own death by toxic snake venom? That would actually be hilarious. In fact, it was red next to black and not black next to red, but forgetfulness was her fatal flaw. That's funny. That's really funny, but it's fucked up. So no, you run and get out of the way. So you see, there really are limits to this language thing as a whole, and we can only describe the real world. We cannot actually make it with our words. And our insistence on trying to dictate what the world is actually causing us much pain and suffering. That's a lot of Buddhism. So back to what Niebauer is saying. So that's far out there into the macro. We're going to bring it back into the micro, but the macro is just a billion little micros. So anyway, your left brain is narrating reality to you as Niebauer contends in this article. And that kind of gets into the inner dialogue or the inner monologue discussion that's been going around a lot on the internet recently. We touched on it in last week's podcast about Trump's speech at the RNC. Some people don't describe the world to themselves. They simply act. There's no inner monologue description. And a lot of these people may be better off because action dictates your life, not thoughts. Thinking for years won't affect your life at all, except maybe negatively. Even philosophers known for their thinking write down what they're thinking. And that's the action that makes them known. Even people who debating is still an action. Thinking in and of itself is not an action. So we see Trump, our former president, and gives his speech, and basically he just describes what happened. not how he felt about it. And I'm like, well, this is kind of a superpower in and of itself, because you're not bogged down by constantly thinking about things, analyzing things, looking for deeper meanings. He's just going and going. As if we interpreted his speech correctly, and we don't know if we did, because we don't know what's in another man's head, just what he says. A lot of us out here, me and maybe others, are really bogged down by an inner monologue or an inner dialogue or an inner chorus. Something all crazy. He's got an inner chorus. The whole neighborhood has got something to say about all your actions. It's all in your head. You know what I mean? But people who don't have that, they might be better off. I'm just saying. Anyway, we live in this society that is constantly thinking about the self and what will make it happy. The problem, Niebuhr argues, is that there is no self. The psychology kick that the United States has been on for a few decades now has us focusing on the self as if that in and of itself is some personal God, which should completely dictate our lives. So that not only is our self a thing, but our self knows what will make us happy. So that's two things we expect from the self, and we don't even know if it exists. We have invested so much time and energy into mental health, and nation's mental health is actually worse than ever. And this is one reason why, perhaps. This is why our self-talk is very important, because our self-talk is literally ourself, at least as we know the self to be. What we say to and about ourselves matters. Often your self-talk is just repeating things that you heard in childhood or memes that you've seen. It's not you at all. It's the outside world filtered through your left brain. It's the outside world in your voice, because you've internalized all these messages that may be very harmful to you. Don't do that. Let's not do that. And that's why it's kind of dangerous to identify with a group. Now, you might be born with certain unalienable characteristics. That doesn't mean you have to go along with an identity group. So you say, what about historical discrimination? And yes, I'm going to get to that. And that's where there's a caveat. These things are not absolutes. The reason I say we shouldn't jump to join into these identity groups is that these group descriptions often come from high and mighty academics who are not familiar with the actual struggles of that group. Someone saying that being Black, white, gay, male, female, or whatever is a disadvantage might negatively affect your self-talk. You might be that thing, but that doesn't mean you are what these academics are saying. So people talk themselves into all these absurd hardships trying to fit into an identity group. So I'm a Black female and I have to act like this to be really Black, or else I'm a nerd, or I'm gay and that means I have to party, or I'm not enjoying the gay lifestyle. Even to say I have a learning disability. I have a learning disability and therefore I cannot achieve great feats. The ones spreading the message, they might mean well, or they could be saying it for clout. We really don't know, but that doesn't let you off the hook, because you're the one who suffers if you listen to them. They won't be there when it all blows up in your face. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, it's wrong. Okay, so here is where I'm going to qualify that. Here's a caveat. That having been said, it mattered if you were Black in 1850 or 1950, and you better have known what that meant, or else you could get really hurt. It mattered if you were Jewish in Poland in the 1930s. You might not now identify with femininity. It doesn't mean you're not going to menstruate. You see where I'm going with these examples? Is yourself not the body that you're in at the time that you're in the place that you're in? So is this self just semantics, something academics talk about? Well, your body in your place and your time is your identity. So is that yourself? No, I guess yourself is a voice within. And here's why I say that science can't really answer this question, why I agree 65% with Niebuhr. Two people who were born in the same time in the same place, let's say they were both born in 1820 in the South, and one makes it to Canada and one doesn't. And let's say for, argument's sake that they are brothers and they had grown up with the same upbringing, but one takes the risk and the other doesn't. Or two cousins born in Poland in 1920, and one makes it to Israel and the other one dies in a concentration camp. One decides to flee in 1933 and one doesn't. So what did the deciding? Within that person, what did the deciding? Here's where free will comes into play, and the difference between Western ideas of self and Eastern ideas of self. Do we have free will, or is everything just predetermined and we are just cogs in the machine? Okay, so I can change my self-talk. Good. But who decides to change my self-talk? I'm in church. I've grown up in this church. My whole family is in this church and all of my friends are in this church. But the doctrine strikes me as false, so I decide to leave. Who decided to leave? Some people, they look at a mountain and they get scared, and some people look at that same mountain and they grab their snowboard. Two people, even though they have the same identity, two people are very, very different. They probably have been since they were babies. So then, is the self simply a personality? Personality being the sum of all of your traits, laid back, stoic, kind. This is kind of a description of you. So there might not be the self as we all know there to be a self, but there's still a nagging voice in my mind that reminds me that people can change personalities if they decide to do so. And this is kind of a controversial thing to say because not everyone thinks that. For example, Homelander in The Boys. He was born a kind and sweet boy, but the scientist turned him into an evil man. Yes, his personality changed. And yes, I am using an example from The Boys. I did a poll last week for another video I'm working on, and it turns out 50% of you don't read very much. So I'm trying to identify with everybody. So The Boys, Homelander, pop culture. Everybody knows pop culture. Or here's an example, for people who don't watch The Boys because you're better than everybody. People join a church and they become Christians, they become whatever, and they accept that message and they become completely different people. This is something we see a lot in cults. People become different people. So these leaders / other members will tell you the right way to be, and followers start acting in that manner. We call it brainwashing, but some people don't agree with that term, brainwashing. But to us, they become completely different people. We might call it brainwashing, but our culture brainwashes. Do you know what I mean? It's just home training, you might call. Is this also brainwashing? The techniques are very similar. Someone, I'm not saying it's me, but someone could have been a piss fire 10 years ago, and now they've completely chilled out. We all know people who are like this, and if you don't, that's probably you. And your family and friends have probably been very patient with you. Also, people change in relationships all the time. Dudes who would be like, I actually loved her, but I did not love the person I became when I was with her. So that kind of becoming a different person depending on your surroundings. Couples, oftentimes, they become like one unit. People with their dogs too. It's just kind of a funny thing. Now, we also talked about this on a recent podcast, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst by the Symbionese Liberation Army. They were this Black leftist revolutionary group that consisted mostly of white people. I know, you heard me correctly. No, that did not make much sense. These white people had taken on the identity of Black radicals, and they took it on so completely that when Patty Hearst lifted her blindfold, she expected to see a room of Black people, and they were all white. They were mostly white. These were middle-class white kids LARPing as Black people, Black revolutionaries more specifically. The last podcast actually covered this much more in depth. And yes, I am researching them for Rate My Cult because that's hilarious and sad, actually. Let's bring it back. So from what we can gather, Eastern philosophy does have a point. The self is ever changing. We create ourselves. We can program ourselves however we want. Want to be a cleaner person? Watch obsessive compulsive cleaners on repeat all day, and eventually your house will just be clean. You'll just look around and be like, oh my God, I've cleaned my entire house. It's because you reprogrammed yourself. Because there is a part of you that can be reprogrammed, a very important part of you. Things like this. There are so many techniques that you can just use to just change your habits. This obsession with looking inwards to find the true self. It's a fool's errand. The cult of the self is destructive, and it only leads to anxiety, which is what we are seeing all around us. But if you're really high, you would ask, who is creating this new self? Is that entity not the self? So why does one person run when they see danger and the other one fights, fight or flight? Is that not the self? So even in Niebauer's example with the split brain subjects, there still seems to be a shadow of a deeper self, even if the self on the ground, i.e. the left brain, is programmable. Now, for the longest time, we did understand that people, or many of us in the West, I'm not 400 years old, but much of the West understood that humans were half animal, half God. And maybe in that worldview, the left brain is actually the God part and the right brain is the animal. Regardless, that is graduate level stuff. And graduate students are broke. Yes, you're thinking, how does this self stuff actually affect my life? I can't pay my bills with a deeper self. I need to start making better decisions today and right now. And by I mean the person the check is made out to. Okay, fantastic. You can actually adopt better habits, and by adopting better habits, it's 10 times more effective than therapy and actually changes your life. Unless you are legitimately chemically or more so mentally ill and you would need a therapist. I will actually link a good video below for those of you who are thinking that it's like, I just need to change my habits. I don't need to know about my deeper self. So Tom Bilyeu actually dedicates his entire channel to improving the self, and there are hundreds of videos there. I'm going to link one that is 30 minutes. It's very digestible, and it can get you started with the basics. You need the basics. Okay, this is a side note. Another tangent's kind of crazy. If the AI makes a replica of you from hundreds of hours of videos and then text and Facebook, etc., is that AI you, not you? Now, if you said no, then you do believe in a deeper self. And yes, this is the transporter argument from Star Trek. The transporter in Star Trek, it makes an exact replica of you in the new location, and your old self is dissolved. So is that new you, or do you die every single time you use the transporter? Let me know in the comments below. Is that AI version of you really you? Is there a self? Is looking inward doomed to failure? The process of trying to find a self, is that doomed to failure? And do people with PhD after their name just worry about irreverent stuff way too much? You let me know. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.